The dress was white. That was the first thing that told her everything she needed to know about what was happening, because in the Ashwood pack, white meant one thing and one thing only: transfer. They called it a tradition, a formality, the color of neutrality, they said, white for a wolf who belonged to no one yet, white for a body being moved between hands like a parcel that had outgrown its shelf. Seraphine Calloway had seen 2 other women dressed in white in her 19 years inside Ashwood's walls. She had never expected to become the third. She stood at the small, cracked mirror in her room and looked at herself for a long time. The dress was plain cotton, no embroidery, no softness to it, just fabric that fit, and a collar that sat too high on her throat, like a hand applying the gentlest possible pressure. Her dark hair was loose. Her face was still. She had learned, early and well, the art of stillness, of keeping every feeling behind her eyes where no one could reach it and use it against her. She had been learning that since she was 4 years old, since the night her parents, Callum and Mara Calloway, didn't come back from the border. She had only scraps of them now. Her father's voice, low and warm, the specific timbre of it when he laughed. Her mother's hands. She remembered her mother's hands better than her face, the way they felt wrapped around her small ones on cold mornings. She remembered being carried. She remembered feeling safe. And then she remembered not. The Ashwood pack had taken her in when no one else would. Alpha Drayden, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, a man who had built his authority on shrewd calculation rather than raw strength, had made the decision with the brisk efficiency of someone resolving a minor administrative problem. The orphaned pup of 2 dead mid-rank wolves was not a burden worth turning away publicly. It would look bad. So she stayed. She worked from the age of 10. Kitchen fires before sunrise, floors swept before the alphas descended, meals prepared, schedules maintained, supplies tracked with the meticulous care of someone who understood that her usefulness was the only thing standing between her and being reconsidered. She was never thanked, never given rank, never told she was anything more than the sum of what she could carry. She found out about the sale the way she found out about most things in Ashwood, by being small enough that people forgot she was in the room. 3 days ago, a corridor outside the document office, 2 men speaking in the particular low tone of people conducting business they feel no shame about. She had heard her name the way you hear something dropped in a quiet house, sudden and sharp and impossible to unhear. Transfer, Black Fang territory, Omega class, household experienced, done. She hadn't slept since. Now the 2 women from the senior household had come and gone, efficient and carefully neutral, leaving the dress and the instructions behind them. She was to present herself in the war room at second bell. Clean, quiet, cooperative. She reached under her mattress. 3 things. That was all she was taking. Because that was all she had, that was truly hers. A wooden wolf, small and rough, carved by hands she could no longer clearly picture, her father's hands. A journal full of years she'd survived without anyone to witness them. And a smooth stone she'd pulled from the river on the morning of her 18th birthday, standing alone at the water's edge because she had wanted, desperately, to mark the day with something, and there had been no one to mark it with her. She pressed the wooden wolf into the deep pocket of the white dress. She walked out of the room without looking back. The war room smelled like whiskey and cold ambition. It was a large space, heavy table, high-backed chairs, a fire burning in the grate that did nothing to warm the actual atmosphere of the room. And Alpha Drayden sat at the head of the table with the settled authority of a man who had never once questioned his right to be there. Around him sat 4 members of his senior council, men she had served meals to for years, and who looked through her now as comfortably as they always had. And across the table, 3 strangers. They were from the north. She could tell by the cut of their clothing, the dark furs and iron-clasped cloaks that the mountain packs favored. The Black Fang Pack had been a name spoken in Ashwood's corridors with the careful respect reserved for things that were dangerous and useful in equal measure. A brutal Northern Territory, people said. A pack that built its power from the ground up and didn't particularly mind what it crushed in the process. The man in the center of the three was called Holt. Now she learned that from the introductions she wasn't invited to participate in, only to witness. He was the Black Fang Alpha's personal beta, a word that carried enormous weight in pack politics, meaning he spoke and moved with his Alpha's full authority behind every word. He was broad, flat-eyed, somewhere in his 40s, with the particular quality of a man who assessed everything as its potential usefulness. He looked at her the way he looked at the documents on the table. She kept her face empty. She kept her hands at her sides. She stood at the far end of the room where they had placed her, not seated, not acknowledged, present only as the subject of the transaction being concluded. And she catalogued exits, faces, distances, the small unconscious tells of every body in the room. It was the only power she had ever had. An observation, memory, the ability to remain so utterly composed under pressure that people forgot to watch what her eyes were doing. Drayden reached for his pen. The door opened. Not with a knock, not with an announcement. It opened the way a horizon changes, something in the quality of everything shifting before you can point to what moved. The candles leaned sideways in a draft that made no sense. The fire lurched, and the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees in the space of a single breath. Every wolf at that table reacted before they understood why. Shoulders dropped, spines curved, a deep, involuntary response to something older than any of them, pressing down on the room like a hand. And then he stepped through the door. She had heard the name Kael Dravenmoor her entire life. Everyone had. The Alpha King of the Voron Dominion, sovereign ruler of 12 packs, lord of the largest unified territory on the continent, the wolf the old texts called a descendant of the original bloodlines, the kind of power that other powers organized themselves around like planets around a sun. She had heard stories that made him into something enormous and loud, something that arrived with ceremony and thunder. He was the opposite of loud. He was still, perfectly, preternaturally still, tall and dark-haired, dressed simply in black with no crown, no decoration, nothing that should have explained why every person in the room with any wolf blood in them was suddenly very aware of how much space they were taking up. His eyes were a silver so pale they caught the firelight and held it. His hands were at his sides. His expression was the composed, almost bored expression of a man who has been the most powerful presence in every room he has entered for so long that he has stopped noticing it. He didn't look at Drayden. He didn't look at Holt. He looked across the room, directly and immediately, at Seraphine. And she, who had not been truly looked at in years, stood completely still and felt the gaze land on her like the first light after a very long dark. Her wolf, small and scarred and half-suppressed from years of careful containment, lurched against her ribcage, not in fear, in something she couldn't name, something that felt old, something that felt, terrifyingly, like recognition. He crossed the room to the table. "I bought her first." He spoke without raising his voice, and yet every word filled the space completely. And the way sound fills water, leaving no room for anything else. He spoke about a debt, 3 years old, the Ashwood Pack's accumulated financial crisis, the trade subsidies, the border enforcement costs, the territorial licensing fees that had quietly compounded into a sum Drayden couldn't pay in currency. He described a meeting, documents signed, a collateral clause negotiated and agreed upon in exchange for Voron's intervention and protection. Her name, he said, was in those documents. Her name had been in those documents for 3 years. Drayden's voice cracked when he tried to object. Something about formalities, about intentions, about a clause he hadn't believed would ever be exercised. His hands, she noticed, were no longer steady. Holt rose from his seat. He was a large man, and he used the fact deliberately, and squaring his shoulders, citing the Black Fang Pack's claim with the forcefulness of someone who had never had a claim challenged before. Kael looked at him. Only that. Just looked. Holt sat down. The room breathed very carefully. Then Kael walked toward her, unhurried, as if there were no 30 witnesses, no whiskey, no unsigned documents, no 2 packs sitting at that table trying to lay claim to her future. He walked toward her the way a man walks toward the only thing in a room that matters, and stopped close enough that she felt the warmth of him, close enough that her wolf pressed its whole weight against the inside of her chest. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and something passed between them in that silence, wordless, ancient, the way 2 things recognize each other before the mind can explain how, that made the packed war room feel very far away. He said, low and private, "You're leaving with me, not them. You have my word." She should have been afraid. She should have been grateful, or overwhelmed, or relieved. She should have felt any of the things a woman in a white dress at the end of a selling table was supposed to feel when a king walked in and stopped the transaction. Instead, she raised her chin and said, "You're a man I've never met, who has a document with my name on it that I never agreed to. Your word is the only thing you've offered me." Something moved behind his silver eyes. Surprise, she thought. Real, unperformed surprise. The specific expression of a person who had been given very few things they didn't expect. "Yes," he said. Simply, "It is." He didn't argue. He didn't add qualifications or gentle the fact of it. He simply stepped back and waited, with the patience of a man who understood that patience was its own kind of power, and Seraphine Calloway, who had been sold twice before she could consent to either, looked at the door. Then she looked at Holt, who was already reaching for the unsigned documents with the confidence of a man whose claim wasn't finished yet. She looked at Drayden, who was not meeting her eyes. She touched the wooden wolf in her pocket, and she walked toward the door, beside the king, not behind him, not escorted, beside him. The rain started the moment they stepped outside, cold, immediate, sheeting across the gray Ashwood courtyard. She didn't have a coat. She didn't stop walking. She didn't look back. Not once. She fell asleep in the vehicle. Of all the things she had expected from the night, fear, tension, the constant vigilance of someone who had just walked out of one claim and into another, she had not expected to simply go under. But the body has its own accounting, and 3 nights without sleep combined with the sudden, enormous crash of adrenaline leaving her system had an argument she couldn't counter. One moment she was watching the dark trees stream past the window. The next, warmth. Heavy and careful and smelling of pine and something deeper. Something old and clean and involuntarily familiar in the way that her wolf responded to it with a slow, sleepy lean before her mind could ask any questions. She blinked into gray pre-dawn light and registered the jacket across her shoulders before she registered anything else. Not her jacket. Far too large. Dark fabric, expensive, the kind of weight that meant it had been placed deliberately by hands that had been careful not to wake her. She went very still. On the other side of the vehicle, Kael sat looking out his window. His jacket was gone from his shoulders, which she had already understood. He held nothing in his hands. He looked at nothing in particular. He was simply there. Present and quiet and unbothered by the silence in the way that only 2 kinds of people are unbothered by silence. People who have nothing to say, and people who have so much they have learned to carry it without speaking. She understood, looking at his profile in the pale morning light, that he was the second kind. She pulled the jacket slightly closer. She did not thank him. He did not look at her. And somehow, in the strange, compressed intimacy of that dark vehicle moving through the dark forest, that was enough. She turned back to her window. The trees were changing, thicker now, older, the kind of forest that had been growing since before the packs had names. The road climbed. The air, even through the glass, felt different, colder and cleaner. The sky ahead was turning from black to a deep, layered gray, and she was watching it when the compound came into view, and every thought she'd been carrying quietly rearranged itself in one involuntary breath. She had expected walls. Every seat of power she had ever seen was built from walls, gray stone and high gates and architecture designed with the single intention of reminding you how small you were. The Ashwood compound had been all corridors and closed doors, every space calibrated toward the same message: you are here because we allow it. The Voron dominion was something else entirely. It was enormous, yes, unquestionably enormous, the main structure rising against the mountain at its back like something that had simply always been there, ancient and permanent as geography. But it breathed. Great old trees grew between the stone wings, their roots cracking politely through the pathways, their branches arching over open corridors that let the sky in. There were wolves everywhere as they passed through the outer gates, guards running perimeter checks, workers crossing the courtyard with purpose, children weaving between adult legs with the noise and freedom of children who had never been told to be quiet in their own home. As Seraphine watched a woman in the courtyard throw her head back and laugh at something the person beside her had said, loudly, without checking who was nearby, without calculating whether it was safe to take up that much air, just laughed. And something in Seraphine's chest opened along a seam she hadn't known was there, a pain she hadn't known she was carrying because she had never had anything to compare it to, because she had never seen a pack where the people inside it simply lived, without apology, without constant calculation. This, her wolf said very quietly, this is what it was supposed to feel like. She caught Kael watching her. He looked away before she could read his expression fully, but she had seen enough, the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth. The particular quality of attention he had been giving her since the war room, not possessive, not strategic, something quieter and more unsettling than either. He brought her inside to a private sitting room, warm, firelit, with 2 chairs arranged near the hearth and a table between them that held coffee already prepared and still steaming, which meant someone had been instructed to have it ready before they arrived, which meant he had been thinking about this conversation during the drive. She catalogued that. She sat down. She wrapped her hands around the cup. She looked at him. "Talk," she said. He explained the debt agreement with the precision of a man who had prepared his words and had decided the most merciful version of this conversation was also the most direct one. 3 years ago, the Ashwood Pack's financial overreach had accumulated into a crisis: trade subsidies unpaid, border enforcement costs outstanding, territorial licensing fees compounded into a figure that Draven could not cover in currency without destabilizing his own pack economy. He had come to Voron. He had asked for intervention. Kael had agreed, with conditions. One of those conditions was a collateral clause, a fallback, a designated asset that would transfer to Voron's authority in the event that Draven failed to settle the debt within the agreed period. The debt had not been settled, the clause had been triggered, and the asset that Draven had offered, signed in his own hand, placed in the clause without hesitation, was her name, her designation, Seraphine Calloway, domestic ward, Omega class, just like that, and signed away like a line in a balance sheet. She sat with that for a moment, sat with the particular cold of learning that the man who had fed and housed her for 19 years had also, without telling her, without once looking her in the eye, gambled her as collateral in a financial negotiation, and lost. "He sold me twice," she said. Her voice was level. It cost her something to keep it that way. Kael's jaw tightened. "Yes. And you—" She stopped, reorganized. "You had no intention of actually claiming it. The clause was just leverage." A pause. "Yes. So what were you doing in that room last night?" The fire moved between them. Outside the windows, the Dominion was waking. She could hear it. the low hum of an enormous living thing starting its day. And he was quiet for long enough that she thought he was choosing evasion. Then he looked at her directly and said, "My intelligence officer flagged the transfer. You were being moved through my borders without my authorization. It was a legal matter that needed to be addressed." She studied him, layer by layer, the way she had always studied things, looking for the place where the surface story and the true one parted ways. "And that's all it was," she said. The silence after that was different from the ones before it, fuller, denser, like a room after a door shuts. He didn't answer, and that, the absence of the answer, told her more than any answer would have. She set her cup down. She looked at this man with his silver eyes and his composed face and his empire spread out around them on all sides, and felt, and for the first time since the war room, something shift in the place beneath fear. Not safety, not yet, but its outline. The shape where safety might eventually stand if she let it. She wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she'd ever been equipped for it. But she noted it, the way she noted everything, and she filed it away. 12 days. That was how long it took Seraphine to understand that the Voron Dominion was both the most comfortable place she had ever lived and the most confusing problem she had ever encountered. Because the compound gave her everything Ashwood had withheld: warmth, space, work that respected the mind doing it, and yet left the most important question completely, deliberately unanswered. Was she free? The woman who managed the household was named Lisa. She was somewhere in her 50s, brisk in the specific way of someone who had been efficient her entire life and had stopped apologizing for it decades ago. She had gray-streaked hair she kept pinned back, a voice like a well-made decision, and eyes that saw through pretense the way daylight sees through glass. She had introduced herself to Seraphine on the second morning, not warmly, not coldly, but with the direct economy of someone deciding within 60 seconds whether a person was useful. Seraphine had, apparently, passed whatever assessment Lisa was running. By the third day, she had been given access to the household supply records and asked, with Lisa's particular brand of barely inflected permission, to look at the kitchen schedule and tell her if she noticed anything. Seraphine had noticed 17 things. She reorganized the supply chain, resolved a scheduling conflict between the groundskeeping rotation and the guard shifts that had been causing quiet friction for months, and cross-referenced the store's inventory against 3 weeks of meal records to identify where waste was bleeding from the budget. Lisa had looked at the results, looked at Seraphine, and said, which was, as Seraphine would learn, high praise. The next morning, a proper desk had appeared beside Lisa's, solid, stocked, deliberately placed. Seraphine hadn't asked for it, no one had mentioned it, but someone had given the instruction, and only one person in the Dominion gave instructions without needing to explain them. She told herself it was administrative, practical, a matter of efficiency. She sat at the desk and did not examine it further. What she could not so easily ignore was what Kael had started doing. Because the Alpha King, ruler of 12 packs, a man with an empire's worth of demands on every hour of his day, had developed a habit. He appeared. At her desk, in a corridor she was crossing, in the doorway of the records room while she was working, materializing with a quiet that she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world, never summoning her, never making it obvious. Just there. Reading over a document she was working on without asking, occasionally making a correction that was almost always right, receiving her pushback on those corrections with an expression she had studied carefully and still couldn't entirely decode, something private, something that lived just beneath composed. It might have been satisfaction. It definitely wasn't indifference. Davon noticed. Davon noticed everything, because Davon, Kael's beta, the second most senior wolf in the entire Dominion, was a man constitutionally incapable of witnessing something interesting without showing it on his face. He was in his late 30s, dark-eyed and quick-smiled, with the quality of someone who had been strategically underestimated so often they had simply started using it. He had introduced himself to Seraphine on her third evening with the cheerful directness of someone who had decided they were going to like her regardless of what she said. She had been suspicious of him immediately. He had found this delightful. He kept looking between her and Kael at evening meals with an expression he made absolutely no effort to suppress. She caught him at it one night and narrowed her eyes. He raised his cup to her in a small private toast. She looked away, but she filed him away too, in the growing mental catalog she was building of this place and its people, and marked him as someone who knew more than he said and said more than anyone expected. Reth was the opposite. Kael's head of security was a big man, a decade older than Kael, with the particular stillness of someone whose job was to identify threats before they became events. He had given Seraphine a single long look on her first day and had been carefully, professionally watchful ever since. Not hostile, not warm. The measured attention of a man still deciding which column she belonged in. She understood him completely, she filed him accordingly. And then there was the silence. The other thing she had noticed, the thing she couldn't reason away or file under practical or administrative, was the distance Kael kept from her. Deliberate and maintained, and something she felt every time he got close enough to matter and then stopped. Pulled back from the edge of something, looked at her, and then, with a discipline she could almost physically see him exerting, stopped looking. It lived under her skin like a splinter, until she could not leave it alone any longer. She sent 3 formal messages requesting a meeting. All 3 were declined. She waited outside his study door for 2 hours and walked through it the moment it opened. He was behind the desk, and something happened in his face when she walked in, fast, unguarded, gone before she could catch it cleanly. What remained was the carefully composed surface she had spent 2 weeks learning to see through. She closed the door. She sat down without being invited. "What am I here?" she said. "Not legally, not on paper. What am I to you?" He told her carefully, a ward of the Dominion, provided for, no demands, no obligations. She was free to move through the territory as she wished. She let him finish. "You keep saying what you won't do to me," she said. "What you won't demand, won't force, won't take, but you haven't told me I can leave." Silence. "Have you? Seraphine, tell me I can walk out of those front gates tonight and you won't come after me." He stood, moved to the window. The Voron forest was enormous outside the glass, green and ancient and indifferent to the particular gravity of what was happening in this room. His jaw was tight. She felt his wolf beneath the surface, the vast, low pressure of it, like something subterranean. "I can't tell you that," he said. "Why?" The silence stretched. She waited it out. She had learned patience in the same place she had learned everything else, necessity. "Because something happened in that war room," he said finally, to the window, "that I have not been able to explain in 12 days of trying." He turned. His face was open, not composed, not managed, just his face, unmediated, showing her something he hadn't shown anyone in a very long time. "I have governed this dominion for 11 years, he said. "Every decision I have made in that time has been considered, calculated. I do not act before I understand why I am acting." "And in that room?" "In that room I was through the door before I had made a single decision about walking in." His voice was very quiet. "And I have been trying to understand that ever since, and I cannot." "Cannot," she said. "Or won't." He didn't answer that either. She stood. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. She looked back at him, at the man with his empire and his 11 years of iron decisions, and his face that had been, for one unguarded moment, completely bare. "I have lived inside beautiful cages my entire life," she said, Ashwood fed me and housed me and never once asked what I wanted or told me the truth, and it dressed that up as care. A pause. The Dominion is warmer. The room is nicer. The view is extraordinary. Her voice didn't shake. She was very proud of that. But a cage is still a cage, Kael, whether the walls are stone or courtesy, and I will not pretend otherwise, not for your comfort and not for mine. She left. She did not hear him move from the window for a very long time. The storm came down from the mountain on the 14th night. Seraphine woke to the sound of it. Wind against old stone, rain in sheets against the windows, the low bass note of thunder rolling across the valley below the Dominion. The kind of storm that felt personal, the kind that stripped away the careful architecture of ordinary days and left only whatever had been true underneath. She lay in the dark of her room for a few minutes, listening. Then she got up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and went to the library. The library was her place. She had claimed it without discussion in the way she had always claimed things she needed, quietly, completely, without asking for permission. It was tall and warm, and smelled of old paper and wood smoke, and whoever maintained it stocked it with the kind of texts that suggested whoever had built the collection was interested in history, not as a sequence of victories, but as a study in how people survived extraordinary pressure. She found that interesting. She had been finding a lot of things about the Voron Dominion interesting in the specific, reluctant way of someone whose worldview was being revised against their will. She settled into her chair, the one on the left, closer to the fire, which had somehow come to be understood by everyone in the compound as hers, without anyone saying so, and opened her book. The fire was already lit. She had stopped questioning that. She had been reading for perhaps 20 minutes when the door opened. She did not look up. She didn't need to. The atmospheric shift was unmistakable now. The way the room's temperature and pressure changed when he entered it, the way her wolf rose toward the surface like something coming up for air. Kael Dravenmoor crossed the room and settled into the chair across from her. He had documents. She had her book. The fire moved between them. The storm was enormous outside the windows, close and loud and dark, and they were two people sitting in the warmth of the same room reading separate things, and it was fine. Strange and fine and deeply, quietly significant in a way she could feel but had not yet decided what to do with. Because this was not a planned conversation. This was not a meeting or a strategic arrangement. This was simply two people who had both come to the same room on a storm-loud night and were choosing, without discussion, to stay. The lights went out, the whole compound dark at once, just the fire remaining, painting everything in amber and shadow, shrinking the room to the small warm circle of its reach. She set down her book. He set down his documents, and the silence between them was different from all the silences before it. Fuller. More honest. The kind that only happens when everything that usually fills the space, performance, composure, the exhausting work of maintaining a surface, has been taken away. She asked him, into that silence, about 11 years ago. She didn't fully know why she asked, except that she had read enough of the Voron Dominion's history in this library to understand that something had happened at the beginning of Kael's reign, some pivot point, some before and after, that the formal records discussed in dates and consequences, but never in the human terms of what it had cost. And she had been watching him long enough now to know that whatever it was, it lived in the place where he stopped himself, in the space between the looking and the pulling back. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would redirect her. He didn't. He told her about a woman named Marin. He did it without performance or self-pity, simply and carefully, the way he did most things. She had not been his fated mate. The bond had not fully formed. But she had been someone he had allowed himself to want, in his first year of ruling a dominion that was still finding its shape, in the brief window before he understood what it meant to be powerful enough that the people who hated you would look for what you loved before they looked for you. They found Marin. She was killed. The message had been precise and deliberate, a rival pack that wanted Kael destabilized, that understood the most effective way to destabilize a new ruler was not to attack his territory, but to attack the single soft place in his defenses. "Show us what you value," the message said, without using those words, "and we will demonstrate what that costs." He had learned. He had locked every gate, buried every soft thing, built a dominion that ran like a perfectly maintained instrument on discipline and intelligence, and the kind of iron personal control that made his enemies give up trying to find a weakness because it appeared, from every angle, that he simply did not have one. 11 years. Seraphine sat with all of that, with the weight of it, with the specific grief of a life spent protecting yourself so completely that you had forgotten what you were protecting yourself for. "That's why you stop," she said. "When you look at me, that's why you pull yourself back." He said nothing, but he didn't deny it. "Because you did that once before, let yourself look, and someone used it against you." The fire, the storm, the silence that was full of something enormous and unspoken. "Yes," he said. One word, with 11 years compressed inside it. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man behind the Alpha King, the part of him that pre-existed the Empire and the iron decisions and the perfectly maintained composure, the part of him that had sat with grief in a locked room for a decade and called it governance. She said carefully, "I'm not going to tell you nothing can touch me. I won't lie to you like that." A pause. "But Kael, I have been surviving things that should have broken me since the night my parents didn't come home. I have been surviving them alone, in packs that forgot to see me, with nothing but 3 objects under a mattress and the ability to keep my face still while my world collapsed." She held his gaze. "I am not easy to destroy." The storm outside, the fire between them, and something in the room, tectonic and permanent and utterly without permission, shifted on its foundation and did not shift back. Neither of them moved. Neither of them had to. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Lisa brought it to Seraphine herself, which was unusual enough to be its own message. She set it on the desk and said, without expression, "You should know what it says before someone decides you shouldn't." Then she walked away. The letter was from the Black Fang Alpha. His name was Voron, a man Seraphine had not yet met, but whose presence had been a shadow over every day since the war room. He had sent it to Kael, written with the polished, dangerous courtesy of someone who wanted his threat to be clearly understood while remaining technically deniable. He expressed regret over the dissolved transfer arrangement. He expressed hope that a reconsidering might be possible, and then, almost as an afterthought, almost casual, he mentioned that he had heard remarkable things about the ward's particular qualities and would be pleased to discuss a generous arrangement. Seraphine read it twice. Then she went to find Kael. She found him coming out of the war room with Reth, who saw her expression and immediately found somewhere else to be, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had decided that whatever was about to happen was above his pay grade. She stopped in front of Kael. She told him what she'd read. She waited. His face told her nothing. His eyes told her everything. A careful, controlled fire that she had learned to read in small increments like reading weather. He told her about the response he'd already sent. Full territorial protection, not ward status, full pack member status under Dominion Declaration, the designation that meant under pack law that she was his, to defend, to protect, to stand between and all comers. "You declared me full pack," she said. "Yes." "Without asking me." A pause. "Yes." She watched his face. "Was it because of the letter?" she asked. "Or had you already decided?" The corridor, the evening light through the high windows, his silver eyes and the particular quality of the silence he held before he answered, the silence of a man doing the last bit of reckoning with himself before he steps off an edge. "I decided," he said, "the morning after the storm." Something moved through her chest, warm and terrifying. That was 3 days ago. Yes. You decided 3 days ago. And you said nothing. He stopped. I was still afraid. She stared at him. Kael Dravenmoor, Alpha King, ruler of 12 packs, the man who had faced down a war room full of alphas without raising his voice, had just told her he was afraid. He raised his hand, slowly, with the care of a man reaching towards something irreplaceable. His fingers brushed her cheek, barely, the lightest possible contact, and her entire nervous system forgot everything it had ever known. I have been trying, he said very quietly, to stop looking at you. Every day since that war room, I have tried, and I have failed, every single time. The words landed in her chest and stayed there. She should have been careful. She had spent her whole life being careful and contained and small enough that no one could use her heart against her. She looked up at him and said quietly, steadily, "Then stop trying." She had never known her blood. That was the thing she kept returning to in the days that followed. Not the warmth of his hand at her cheek, not the word afraid spoken in his steady voice, not the way the bond between them had gone from a hum to something she felt in her bones every time he entered a room. Those things were real and enormous, and she was not yet ready to fully look at them. What she kept returning to was her blood, because 5 days after the storm, Kael came to find her in the training yard, where she had been working with Reth every morning since the day Kael had casually and infuriatingly enrolled her in combat training without asking, and he dismissed Reth with a look, and he stood in front of her in the gray morning air with a tension around his eyes she had not seen before. Not danger. Something worse. The tension of a man about to hand someone something heavy. He told her about his intelligence officer, a sharp, quiet woman named Civ, the woman responsible for running the Dominion's information network, who spoke rarely and always accurately, who had come to Kael 4 days ago with a genealogical report and the specific expression of someone who understood the weight of what they were delivering. Civ had found a thread in the bloodline records. She had pulled it, and what had unraveled behind it had rewritten everything Seraphine believed about her own existence. Her parents had not been mid-rank wolves. They had not been unremarkable members of a mid-tier pack who died in a routine rogue attack and left a daughter behind. That was the story. The clean, convenient, unremarkable story that had been built around her life like scaffolding, solid enough to stand, deliberately designed to be looked at and not looked through. The truth was something else entirely. The Calloway bloodline, her bloodline, traced back to one of the original 12 founding wolves, the alphas who had established pack law itself centuries ago, before territories and treaties and political architecture. The bloodlines that, even now, even diluted by generations of ordinary time, carried a weight that could not be legislated away. Her parents had known. They had known and they had run. Not from danger they stumbled into, but from danger that had been following them. They had chosen Ashwood for its obscurity, buried themselves in its ordinariness, scrubbed their daughter from bloodline registries, and called her a ward and an orphan, and made her invisible in the specific, precise way of 2 wolves who understood that visible meant targetable. They had not been killed by rogues. They had been killed by people who had finally found them. And the Black Fang pack, Voron, his letter, his quietly hired genealogist, had known about the bloodline for far longer than they should have. Seraphine stood very still in the training yard and let all of it land. She thought about the war room and the white dress. She thought about 19 years of being the debt, the burden, on the ward nobody claimed. She thought about Drayden's pen reaching for that document and her name sitting in Kael's archive for 3 years, an asset that didn't know it was being held. She thought about her father's wooden wolf in her pocket. And she felt, not grief. She had expected grief. Instead, something rose in her that was older and fiercer and shaped exactly like the thing that had kept her standing in that war room with her chin up while powerful men tried to reduce her to a transaction. Rage, the clean kind, the clarifying kind, the kind that doesn't burn out of control but burns instead with a precise, directed heat. "They killed my parents," she said, "to keep me from knowing." "Yes." "And Vorik knew." "We believe so." She turned to face him. "Then we find out everything he knows," she said. "Before he uses any of it." Kael looked at her. That look, the one she had no single word for, the one that lived in the space between awe and anguish, and something fiercely, protectively warm. "We," he said. "We," she said back, and neither of them felt the need to explain further. Vorik's delegation arrived at the Dominion's northern border 5 days later. 30 wolves, no announcement, armed and organized in the specific formation of people who wanted to be read as a statement rather than a threat, which was itself a kind of threat. They carried a formal demand dressed in the careful language of pack diplomacy, Seraphine Calloway to be surrendered to Black Fang custody for bloodline verification under neutral authority. Kael went to the border himself. He brought Reth. He brought 4 senior guards. He did not bring an army, because an army would have suggested that he considered this a contest, and he did not consider it a contest. He stood at the edge of his territory in the gray morning and let the Black Fang lead representative speak the entire demand from beginning to end without interrupting once. He gave them the courtesy of being heard completely. Then he said, in the voice that did not need volume to be final, "The woman you are describing was registered as a full member of the Voron Dominion 11 days ago. She carries the legal status of founding bloodline under Dominion protection. Any attempt to remove her from this territory is an act of war against the Dominion and all 12 packs bound under its treaty." He paused. "I recommend you go home." The delegation was silent. The morning air was very cold. 30 wolves and 1 alpha king, standing at a border, and the 30 wolves were doing the specific arithmetic of men who had expected a negotiation and found instead a wall. One of the younger wolves, the hot-blooded kind, the kind that hadn't yet learned the cost of mistaking silence for weakness, reached for his weapon. Reth's hand closed around his wrist before the motion was complete, not roughly, just closed, immovable. The absolute, unhurried certainty of someone who does not need to escalate because escalation has never been in question. Kael had not moved, had not flinched, had not changed his expression by a single degree. The delegation left. He stood at the border for a long time after they disappeared into the tree line, looking north toward Black Fang territory, and toward Vorik and his genealogist and his carefully worded letters. Toward the people who had killed 2 wolves for the inconvenience of their blood and had spent 19 years waiting for the heir of that blood to surface so they could deal with her the same way. His wolf was not restless. It was absolutely, finally still, the stillness of something that has made its decision completely and has nothing left to reckon with. He turned back toward the Dominion, toward her. She was at her window when he knocked. She had learned his knock 3 times, unhurried, the same every time, the knock of a man who was not accustomed to knocking and had developed the habit specifically for her. She said, "Come in," without turning around, and listened to the door open. His footsteps crossed the room, the silence that settled when he stopped. She turned. He looked open. That was the only word for it. The composed surface she had spent weeks learning to read was simply gone, and what was beneath it was a man standing in the aftermath of every wall he had spent 11 years building, choosing not to rebuild them, feeling everything that poured in through the spaces where the walls had been. He told her the border had been handled, that Vorik would not move immediately, that Civ was still tracking the full depth of the Black Fang Pack's knowledge of her bloodline, and that they would deal with each piece as it surfaced. "This isn't finished," he said. "Your bloodline makes you a target that doesn't disappear overnight." "I know. There will be more of it." More of them. I know that too. He looked at her. I will not let them reach you. Kael. She said his name the way she had learned to say it, without title, without deference, just his name, direct and honest. I know you won't. That's not what I've been waiting for you to say. The room. The last light of the evening. The bond between them pulled so taut it almost had a sound, a low, constant vibration at the frequency of something that had been true for a very long time and was only now being acknowledged. He crossed to her. He stopped close, closer than the library fire, closer than the corridor, closer than every carefully maintained distance of the past weeks. And he raised his hand and held it near her face for a moment without touching, like a man asking permission from something older than language. She turned her face into his palm, his eyes closed. One breath. Slow. The sound of a man setting down something very heavy that he had been carrying for a very long time. When he opened his eyes, she was there, still there, watching him, the wooden wolf carved by her dead father in her pocket, and 19 years of survival in the set of her shoulders, and the specific, extraordinary stillness of a woman who has learned that strength doesn't announce itself. He said, I did not come to that war room for a legal matter. She didn't move. I came because my wolf felt you, through 100 miles and every wall I have built to make sure I never feel anything from that distance again. It felt you, and it said one word, and I was in the vehicle before I fully understood what I was doing. What word? She asked, quietly. Mine. The word fell between them and stayed. Not because of a document, he said, not because of a debt or a clause or a legal technicality, because something in me recognized something in you before I ever saw your face. And when I walked into that room and saw what they were doing, what they had reduced you to, what your whole life had been reduced to, he stopped. His jaw tightened. I could not walk back out, he said. I could not stand there and let it continue. Not for any political calculation, not for any reason I had to plan or decide. I simply could not. Seraphine's throat was full of something that had no name. She thought about a little girl who had pressed her face into a pillow so no one would hear her cry for parents who were never coming back. She thought about a woman in a white dress at the end of a selling table, and keeping her hands still and her face empty and her chin level because it was all she had left to hold on to. She thought about 19 years of being worth exactly what she could carry and nothing more. And she thought about this man, this enormous, complicated, quietly devastated man, who had walked through a door and seen her, not the ward, not the transaction, not the collateral or the debt or the Omega-class designation in a dusty archive. Her. She lifted her hand and touched his jaw, just her fingertips, light as anything, and felt the breath go out of him like a tide. You should know, she said, that I don't do anything quietly. I never have. I argue with people who are wrong even when it costs me. I take up space even when I'm not supposed to. I ask questions that make powerful men uncomfortable. I know, he said. And something happened at the corner of his mouth, that ghost of a thing, fuller now, warmer. I've noticed. And you still, and I still, he said, completely. She looked at him. Then she closed the last inch of distance between them. He kissed her the way he did everything, with complete, unhurried attention, as though nothing in the world existed outside this moment, and he intended to give it everything the moment deserved. Soft at first, reverent. The beginning of something he understood was permanent and was choosing to begin with the appropriate weight. And then she kissed him back. And careful became something else, something inevitable. The bond between them, that thing that had been humming since a war room and a white dress and a door that opened like the air had made a decision, stopped humming. It sang, loud and certain and old as bloodlines, old as the founding wolves, old as the truth her parents had died to protect, and that no ledger and no auction and no white dress had ever actually managed to touch. because they had tried to sell her. They had tried to transfer her and trade her and sign her name across the bottom of documents she never consented to. And what they had not understood, what none of them had ever understood, was that you cannot sell something that was never actually theirs. Seraphine Calloway had always belonged to herself, and tonight, in the warmth of a room inside the Dominion that the old texts would eventually record as the night the Alpha King finally came home to something worth ruling for, she chose. Not because she was claimed, not because a document said so, because she looked at a man who had walked through fire to stand in front of her, who had buried his heart for 11 years and unburied it for her, who had said mine not like a command, but like the most helpless, honest truth he had ever spoken, and she looked back the same way. Like his was a place she had been trying to find for 19 years without knowing it had a name. Outside, the Voron Dominion hummed with its own enormous life. The old trees breathed in the dark. Somewhere below, Devon was almost certainly telling Reth something insufferable with great personal satisfaction. Lysa was almost certainly pretending not to know what was happening on the upper floor, and in the room at the top of the mountain keep, the Alpha King held the woman the world had tried to make invisible, and the woman held him back, and neither of them let go.